This is a continuation of our lecture, and we're on point E, 3 ways God works in the world. So you've got this creator who brought things into being, and very committed because he's loving and good, benevolent, to superintending how things play out and watching and guarding and protecting all of this. Now, 3 ways God works in the world. I'm wondering if next time I give this lecture, I should make the point that it's 3 ways God graciously works in the world. You know, one of the greatest Christian words of all time is grace. And I'm going to upload as an optional recommended reading just a small piece by our own Professor Andre Ong on grace from the Dictionary of Christian Spirituality. It's just a couple of pages, but it's wonderful. And just sets a tone for a grace-focused orientation to how God works in the world. And I think it's unfortunate that some Christians think God only works in one way. And it's the way they endorse, and they reject the possibility of anything else. But I think it's really important to understand and validate, affirm, celebrate the different ways God is working grace into the world he has created. And one of those is that God is working grace in nature. When plants grow and they can be harvested for food, God's grace is at work. When gentle breezes cool the earth, when the rains come, when you get a wound on your arm and then you look a couple of weeks later and it's all healed over. What's that about? Well, it's God's grace working itself out through natural processes. You mean there's grace in nature? Well, what is nature but the work of the Creator God? So we shouldn't be surprised to see the fingerprints of the gracious Creator in nature. And we shouldn't diminish that and say, well, that's just secular. No, that's divine grace working itself out in natural processes. But then there's also the way that God, who's the God of providence, orchestrates things so that we recognize patterns of grace in coincidental meetings, in the convergence of unexpected developments. We can see the hand of God in events, and we can't say that any single part of that sort of network of events was supernatural, but we see the patterns of grace. When my wife and I got to Scotland, it was such a step of being led all the way. 7 months pregnant she was and all, and we sat down and we identified 15 things that were signs to us that God's hand was upon us. None of them were miraculous, but they were a pattern of grace. And may God give us the eyes as Christians to see the patterns of grace. So that's a second way God works in the world. And the third is that God does work still in the miraculous, in the signs and the wonders. And I think that if we have a theology that says that can't happen, that never happens, that's all just superstition, we lose a sense of anticipation and wonder and adventure in our understanding of how God is present and active in the world. So there's a mix of those 3 ways that God works in the world. And I think it's healthy to be open to all of them and appreciative of all of them. Now, common grace. Common grace. You see, now I've set you up to appreciate that not all grace is supernatural grace. Okay? So, having said that, common grace is a theme that's enormously important to the integration of a therapist's calling as a Christian and the Christian faith. So one of the best pieces I've come across so far on this topic and its topic is the work of Richard Mouw. And the brief little article we've assigned from Richard Mouw on this topic is expanded in a thin but substantive little book called He Shines in All That's Fair. And that's from a Christian hymn of a previous generation. God shines in all that's fair, meaning beautiful, delightful, and good. God shines in all of that. And I'd encourage you to make a note of that book. And also, don't hesitate to please read carefully Lydia Kim Van Dalen's article, where she thinks about common grace and its implications for doing psychotherapy. So right in our wheelhouse, right in the area that we care about, she's done this work. And that article is one of the ones that I think is an essential article for your study in this course. So let me just point out to you that she says in that article that the Holy Spirit may work through secular psychotherapy to bless people in general, to restrain sin in this world, to prepare people for salvation, and to aid in the progressive sanctification of believers. So what I guess we're saying is the realization that there is such a thing as common grace means that there's no such thing as a secular sphere in which God is excluded or off limits. That good work done that blesses other people can be instruments. You can be an instrument of God's grace. Isn't that wonderful? And even the discoveries of secular psychotherapists, researchers, can be part of God's gracious activities. So common grace is hugely important. I provided a few biblical texts for you on this to consider and to weigh and to appreciate. Kim Van Dalen in her article differentiates common grace from special grace. Well, I've expanded that pair into three, and so I've widened out what she calls special grace into its two subsets: embodied grace and redemptive grace. So, in summary, I agree with her entirely on the importance and reality of common grace, but at the same time, I see that the special grace can be a grace that you embody for the blessing of others, as well as the redemptive grace that comes through Christ for the ultimate deliverance from the sin, the consequences of pain and suffering in the world. Redemptive grace is the complete solution to the restoration of human flourishing. And so, where redemptive grace is not yet fully embraced, the gracious God is still hidden to people, even while they may be experiencing the benefits of his common grace, as well as the benefit of the grace that's mediated to them through you, and which you embody as his hands, his feet. You see, that's the vision here. And I think that common grace is very significant. Now, common grace is not an alternative salvation plan. It's not a complete solution. It's limited, but not unimportant. And so try to work out where that fits in both its significance and its limitations. Think through the balance of that. And I do believe that within the framework of what we're calling common grace, and you in a sense as an embodiment of grace to others, that's where there's real congruence. There can be real congruence between your calling as a therapist and what the Bible teaches about how God is acting in the world and how he uses people as instruments of his great and good purposes. All right, I'm going to leave it at there. All the best.